In October 2023, Hungarian military divers lifted a section of Messerschmitt engine cowling from the floor of Lake Balaton. Beneath layers of mud and lake deposits, red paint was still visible. As the surface was cleaned, the marking became unmistakable. 12. A red 12. That number should not have been there. For decades, the story associated with Hungarian fighter pilot Sándor Beregszászi said that his Messerschmitt had already been recovered from Lake Balaton long ago. Parts of a Bf 109 had in fact been pulled from the lake near Balatonkenese in the 1950s, and over time that wreck had become linked with Beregszássi's final flight. But the aircraft now being excavated by military divers lay roughly 3.5 kilometers offshore, buried deep beneath the sediment. And on its cowling was the tactical number connected to Beregszászi in wartime photographs. If this was Red 12, then the aircraft everyone thought had been recovered was the wrong Messerschmitt. To understand why that mattered, the story has to return to Hungary in the summer of 1944. Sándor Beregszászi was 21 years old and served with a Royal Hungarian Air Force fighter squadron designated 101/1. His squadron operated Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 fighters at a time when Allied air operations over Hungary were becoming larger and more frequent. Beregszászi was not new to combat. In April, he had shared credit for an American B-24. Later that month, he survived the bombing of his own airfield. On the 24th of May, he was wounded in another aerial engagement. A surviving wartime photograph shows him beside a Messerschmitt carrying the tactical number Red 12. His final aircraft was a Hungarian-produced Bf 109 G6, identified as V830, with production number 95,286. It had been completed at Győr on the 1st of June 1944. Barely a month later, it was gone. On the 2nd of July, the United States 15th Air Force launched a major operation against targets in Hungary. Hungarian fighters rose to intercept. 18 fighters under Major Aladar Hepes took part in the fighting described by later research. The losses were severe. 9 Hungarian Messerschmitts were reported shot down, and 3 Hungarian pilots were killed. One of them was Beregszászi. A Hungarian gendarmerie report written days later stated that a Hungarian Messerschmitt 109 had been shot down in aerial combat and had crashed into Lake Balaton with its pilot. Beregszássi's death registration and later archival research connect him securely with that loss. What happened in the final moments of the fight is less certain. No surviving report gives a complete sequence of Beregszássi's last engagement. Later researchers have examined Hungarian records, American combat reports, and the location of the wreck. Pilots of the United States 82nd Fighter Group are considered the strongest candidates for having attacked him, but no individual victory claim can be matched to Red 12 with enough certainty to name a specific American pilot. It is also unclear exactly where Beregszászi was first hit. He may have been damaged during the fighting and tried to return toward Veszprém. He may have been hit closer to the lake. The surviving evidence cannot settle that point. One detail recovered with the wreck adds another piece to the puzzle. Red 12's external fuel tank appears to have remained attached to the aircraft. Researchers believe it probably failed to release. A drop tank that stayed aboard would have added drag and reduced the fighter's maneuverability, but there is no evidence strong enough to say that it caused the loss. What is certain is the result. Red 12 hit Lake Balaton hard. Beregszászi was killed. His body was recovered and taken to Turkova, where he was buried. The aircraft remained in the lake. But for decades, another story took its place. In the 1950s, parts of a Messerschmitt 109 were recovered from the Balatonkenese area under the direction of Lajos Holosi. An engine, wing, and fuselage components were brought up. The recovery was real, but precise documentation identifying that wreck did not survive clearly enough to establish which aircraft it had been. At the same time, a local account developed around Beregszászi. In that version, he had brought his damaged fighter down relatively close to shore. Local people had supposedly reached him by boat. His aircraft was later recovered. The two stories fitted together easily. There was a known Hungarian fighter pilot lost at Lake Balaton. There was also a real Messerschmitt recovered from the lake near the same general area. Over time, they became the same story. There was little reason to question it. Beregszássi's aircraft was considered found. The case seemed closed. Then, in the autumn of 2010, a fisherman caught his anchor on something beneath the lake. When the anchor finally came free, a piece of sheet metal reportedly came up with it. The information eventually reached military historian and aircraft wreck researcher Karol Mago through Laszlo Fiel. In May of 2011, Mago considered the lead, but a piece of metal and a position in a large lake were not enough to identify an aircraft. The trail went quiet. Almost 9 years passed. Then, in February of 2020, Fiel contacted Mago again with additional information. This time, the lead could be compared with years of research into wartime aircraft losses around Lake Balaton. In September, military divers taking part in Jackal Cave 2020 searched the location. They found an aircraft. It lay under roughly 5 meters of water, but the real obstacle was below the lake bed. Much of the wreck was buried beneath a heavy layer of sediment. The fuselage had broken behind the cockpit. Loose equipment and pieces of the airframe were scattered around the main structure. Small components were raised first. Hungarian servicing markings and manufacturing details showed that the wreck belonged to the Hungarian Messerschmitt production system. The position itself immediately challenged the old account. This was not the nearshore wreck described in the old story. It lay roughly 2 miles offshore. And the condition of the wreck suggested that it had not simply settled there after an easy landing. Even before the main recovery, location, burial, and surviving damage were beginning to point away from the story that had been repeated for decades. Then came the red paint. A fragment from the engine cowling carried part of a red tactical number, 12. That changed the question. The divers had not simply found another Bf 109 in Lake Balaton. They had found a wreck carrying the marking associated with Beregszászi. But one painted fragment was not enough to rewrite decades of accepted history. The aircraft itself still had to be excavated, documented, and identified. 3 years later, the Hungarian military returned to do exactly that. The main recovery began on the 6th of October, 2023. The operation involved 9 military organizations and 76 personnel. Diving work eventually continued across 17 days. Lake Balaton is not especially deep at the wreck site. The water was only about 4.5 to 5 meters deep. But shallow water did not make the work simple. The aircraft was buried under roughly 80 centimeters to 1.5 meters of sediment. As soon as divers began clearing the mud, visibility collapsed. In places, they could see only a few centimeters. At times, they were effectively working blind. One contemporary description captured the problem perfectly. The divers had to see with their 10 fingers. 2 pontoons were assembled as a working platform above the site. Divers cleared sediment, exposed components, and brought up smaller pieces. Each object was photographed and logged so researchers could identify where it had come from and how it related to the rest of the wreck. This careful excavation revealed a problem that could not be understood from the surface. The recovery therefore became an exercise in learning the aircraft before asking it to move. Every section exposed by the divers changed what could safely be done next. A connection that looked usable on a drawing might no longer exist underwater. A part hidden in mud might prove stronger than expected. The team could not treat the wreck as a complete fighter simply because its major pieces were still close together. They had to discover piece by piece what 80 years beneath the lake had actually left them. The aircraft had not deteriorated evenly. Some aluminium alloy structures had survived surprisingly well beneath the sediment. Other parts had corroded almost completely away. That difference mattered most around the engine. On an intact Bf 109, The Daimler-Benz engine is held in place by a structural mounting system designed to carry its weight in flight. After almost 80 years underwater, the recovery team could not assume those connections still existed. They did not. The engine mounts and parts of the reduction gear housing were too badly degraded to trust during a combined lift. The original plan therefore changed. The wreck would not be raised as one aircraft. The propeller assembly would come first, then the engine. Only after those loads were removed would the surviving airframe be lifted. On the 10th of October, the first major assembly left the lake. The divers recovered the propeller hub with 2 propeller blades. Then they worked deeper around the engine and cockpit area. Parts of the aircraft's armament appeared, including its MG-131 machine guns. 2 days later came the discovery that turned the historical argument into something physical. On the 12th of October, the left engine cowling was raised. The mud was removed. The number was still there, red 12. This was not a marking reconstructed from memory. It was paint surviving on the aircraft itself. A wartime photograph had shown Beregszászi beside a fighter carrying that number. His family memorial also preserved the association with 12. Now the same marking had appeared on a Messerschmitt buried much farther offshore than the aircraft described in the old story. The evidence was becoming difficult to explain away. But the recovery was not finished. The engine still had to come out. The operation had expected to use a crane pontoon for the lift, but weather complicated the positioning of the intended equipment. The team adapted by using the crane mounted on a Kraz 255B truck that had been supporting bridge equipment at the site. One original lifting point at the front of the engine had survived in usable condition. Divers attached the sling there. The choice mattered. The goal was not simply to pull the engine upward. By lifting from the front, the team could allow it to separate gradually from the weakened remains of the fuselage instead of dragging the entire front structure with it. On the 18th of October, the engine rose out of Lake Balaton. It was a Daimler-Benz DB 605A, and its serial number could still be read. The recovery had now removed one of the heaviest pieces from the wreck. That opened access to what remained behind it, and it revealed another mystery. The aircraft simply stopped behind the cockpit. The rear fuselage was missing. The recovery team searched for it with bathymetric and forward-looking sonar. The surrounding lake bed was scanned for a large structure projecting above the sediment. Nothing obvious appeared. But that did not mean the missing section was gone. A large metal object exposed on the bottom is easier for sonar to detect than one buried deeply in mud. So the divers widened the excavation in circles around the main wreck, using sediment pumps to search below the surface. Still, no complete rear fuselage emerged. 2 possibilities remained. Parts of it may have been removed sometime during the decades before the official recovery. Or the violent impact may have thrown them farther from the main wreck, where they could still be buried too deeply for the search methods used in 2023. The operation could not resolve that question. The main wreck, however, was ready for the next step. Weather repeatedly delayed the final heavy lift. When conditions allowed work to continue on the 26th of October, the divers returned to the surviving forward fuselage and wing root structure. By then, they had spent days learning the shape of the aircraft through mud and darkness. They knew where the stronger structure remained and where corrosion had removed material. Visibility during the final rigging was still extremely poor. The lifting equipment had to be placed around an aircraft that the divers could barely see. Earlier in the recovery, the condition of the engine mounts had already forced a change in plan. The engine could not simply remain attached while the whole wreck came up. Now the remaining structure faced its own test. The cables took the load. The forward fuselage began to move. The wreck rose, and this time it did not come apart. The surviving forward fuselage and wing root assembly reached the pontoon intact enough to be handled and transferred for conservation. The recovery had succeeded. The contrast was important. The operation had begun with an aircraft that could barely be seen and whose structural condition was unknown. By the end of the lift, the largest surviving assembly was above water and available for direct examination. The recovery had not restored Red 12. It had changed the wreck from an underwater mystery into physical evidence that could finally be compared with the documents. But it had not produced a complete airplane. Even while the main structure was being taken ashore, divers continued searching the site. Among the later substantial pieces recovered was the gun cover from the area ahead of the cockpit armor glass. At the end of the operation, a diver placed a wreath on the lake bed in memory of Beregszászi. Then the work moved from recovery to examination. For the first time in almost 80 years, researchers could study the surviving structure of Red 12 outside the lake. The damage told a story very different from the old account of a relatively controlled nearshore ditching. Some of what they saw had occurred during the war. Other damage had been added much later, after anchors snagged the wreck beneath the lake. Researchers had to separate the two. Around the windshield, wing root, and forward fuselage, they found damage consistent with combat and severe impact. A cooling system pipe had been punctured. The left side of the aircraft had suffered heavily. The left wing attachment showed major failure. The forward fuselage was badly deformed. The propeller was bent. The engine-mounted cannon barrel was damaged. Taken together, the physical evidence indicated a violent contact with the water. Researchers reconstructed the left wing as striking first, followed by the engine. That reconstruction cannot tell us every second of Beregszássi's final flight. It cannot identify the American pilot who hit him. It cannot prove exactly where his aircraft first became critically damaged. But it does show that the wreck discovered far offshore does not fit the old image of a comparatively gentle landing close to the bank. The recovery had also produced the most decisive identifier of all. As sediment and shell growth were cleared from the left side of the recovered fuselage, the aircraft data plate was found. Production number 95,286. Hungarian designation V830. The archival records matched. This was the fighter completed at Győr on the 1st of June, 1944. This was the aircraft associated with Sándor Beregszászi. This was Red 12. The mystery created by the cowling was finally resolved. The Messerschmitt recovered in the 1950s may have been another Hungarian Bf 109, but it could not simply be treated as Beregszássi's Red 12 any longer. His aircraft had remained beneath Lake Balaton, farther offshore, for almost 8 decades, and once it was ashore, Red 12 revealed something else. It was often convenient to describe the aircraft simply as a Hungarian-made Messerschmitt. The wreck showed that wartime production was more complicated. Detailed examination found major components carrying identities associated with other planned aircraft and production streams. The left wing, for example, was linked to another Hungarian aircraft designation. Other parts had their own production histories. Researchers believe this patchwork reflected the disruption of Hungarian aircraft production in 1944. After the factory began dispersing, available components from different production batches appear to have been used to complete aircraft. Red 12, therefore, preserved more than the story of one pilot and one crash. Its structure preserved evidence of how Hungary was still building combat aircraft in the final phase of the war. As of the most detailed study of the wreck, it was the only known surviving Hungarian-produced Messerschmitt 109. The recovered engine, fuselage sections, and smaller components entered the collection of the Hungarian Military History Museum System for conservation. Parts of the aircraft have since been shown publicly under the name Red 12. But the recovery did not bring back everything. The rear fuselage was never conclusively located. Other fragments may still lie somewhere beneath the sediment around the original crash site. For decades, history said Red 12 had already left Lake Balaton. A fisherman's anchor reopened the question. Military divers found the wreck. A red number linked it to a wartime photograph. A data plate gave the aircraft its identity back. And in October of 2023, the surviving core of Beregszássi's fighter finally rose from the lake. But not all of Red 12 came back.